There it was, a fragment of the universe hurtling through the cosmos. And there I was, gazing up from the comfort of a farmhouse rooftop, built by my father's bare hands, smack dab in the middle of nowhere. In all the years we lived out there on the countryside, not a damn thing remarkable ever happened. This meteor shower, this was the highlight of my entire life. And that's why, with a bit of wonder glazed over my eyes, I wished on that one shooting star, brighter than all the rest. I wished for some excitement. Almost as if in answer to my plea, the meteor took a U-turn and fell from the sky like a falcon diving for its prey. I watched, astonished, as it passed overhead and crashed into the wooded area, just right behind my dad's property. Surprisingly, there was no sound, no explosion, just the rustling of tree leaves as it plummeted through the forest canopy. To make matters more peculiar, I swear I saw a red glow emanating from the crash site, however faint. After the initial shock wore off, I climbed down from the roof and raced into the forest as fast as my scrawny legs would allow. I had a rough idea of where the thing landed, so I darted in that direction, hoping I could take home a chunk of space rock as a souvenir to show my father. If I was lucky, it would be a treasure thrilling enough to keep him from getting mad that I went off into the woods by my lonesome. I could only hope. Eventually, I came to a small clearing where the moonlight gently caressed the earth, granting me a somewhat clearer picture of the flora and fauna around me. I noticed many small animals. They were frantically scurrying north for no discernible reason. I surmised that the meteor's landing frightened the wildlife nearby, and so I decided to head off in the opposite direction. Sure enough, after maybe 10 more minutes of my impromptu hike through the wilderness, I came upon the source of the mysterious glow I'd seen before. It was no meteor. There, sitting in a small depression in the ground, was a metallic pod of sorts, complete with a blinking beacon protruding from its surface like an antenna. The craft itself was spherical and at least twice my height. I'd never seen anything like it before. I was utterly dumbfounded. Before I could take a closer look, a hatch opened up from its side, startling me back into the woods. With a racing heart, I scuttled behind the nearest tree. I cautiously positioned my head around the trunk and spied on the object with bated breath. I didn't know what to expect. Was it some kind of top-secret military weapon? Or perhaps a remote-controlled gadget built by a genius hermit living nearby? Would a little green man step out to greet me, demanding to speak with my leader? No matter the outcome, my eyes were glued to that metallic pod, for better or for worse. A dark violet ooze spilled from the object, forming a large puddle at its base. The slimy substance then scaled the pod, coating the exterior from top to bottom. As the slime moved around the sphere, the light above stopped blinking. All at once, the purple liquid was repelled from the craft and back onto the ground below. There, it began taking on a more humanoid shape. As the ooze changed, so too did its color. It became white and fuzzy, not unlike television static. Appropriately enough, TV and radio dialogue soon filled the forest. This thing was collecting signals from thin air, regurgitating lines from popular programs long since broadcast. At least, that's what it appeared to be doing. My mouth agape in awe, I began leaning forward without realizing it. The signal ceased abruptly, and I fell, head first onto a pile of dead branches, creating a loud crunch. From my new vantage point, I watched the white figure turn to my direction. I then heard it speak. "Who's there?" Its voice was shaky and unnatural, a low monotone growl coupled with a harsh reverb. Scared for my life, I picked myself up and ran back home, faster than I ever had ran before. I reclaimed my perch on the roof and carefully surveyed the property. Once I was sure I hadn't been followed, I hopped through my bedroom window and climbed into bed, hoping that I dreamt the whole thing up, an adventure concocted by my imagination running wild. I wished it were that simple, but wishful thinking rarely plays out in one's favor. The following day, I came downstairs to the familiar aroma of eggs and bacon. My father always cooked up a hearty breakfast on Sundays. The sight I was greeted with upon entering the dining room, however, was anything but familiar. There, sitting at the table across from my father, was a man in a clean-cut suit, wearing a bowler hat and a striped tie. We rarely entertained visitors, so I was more than a little perplexed. "Son, this is Mr. Grovewood. His car broke down a couple miles up the road, so he's gonna be staying with us a few nights, just until he could get things sorted out." "How do you do, sport?" I remained silent, perturbed by the man's presence and still shaken from the previous night. "He's paying us a generous sum to stay here, so you best treat him with respect." My dad glared at me in the way that effectively relayed his meaning. As such, I complied. "I'm well, sir. Thank you for asking." The man smiled, albeit awkwardly, and I ran off outside to tend to the farm. I didn't know why, but I'd suddenly lost my appetite. Something just wasn't adding up. How did this stranger find the farm after his car broke down? We were literally surrounded by forest. Dumb luck, perhaps? Doubtful. I was beginning to feel that his appearance the day after that thing landed in the woods wasn't a mere coincidence. But this wasn't a theory I had enough nerve to explore. After all, I had already convinced myself that the previous night's events were nothing more than a bad dream. The man would be gone in a few days either way, so I tried not to dwell on it. The next couple of nights were bizarre. Mr. Grovewood attempted to watch a sitcom with us while eating dinner, but his reactions were less than normal. He seemed confused by the program and would only laugh after he noticed us laughing. And this wasn't just any laughter, mind you. It was a loud guffaw of intensely uncomfortable proportions. I was almost relieved when he got pulled away by a phone call from a business colleague, though I didn't hear a single word exchanged. The following night, I walked downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of milk, only to find Mr. Grovewood chowing down on a raw steak from the freezer. I asked him about it, and all he said was, "It's a little midnight snack. Trust me, a little color does the body good." Needless to say, I ran back to my room in a hurry, without my milk. Last night, however, is when I became truly afraid. Walking past the guest room to get to the bathroom, I overheard Mr. Grovewood on the phone. This time, he most certainly spoke. "Did you receive the information I transmitted?" "Yes. This is the language we must use from here on out. We must avoid suspicion and blend in with the rest. It's a lovely place, rich in minerals, water, and life forms. You and the others are going to like it here. So long as you're ready. There's no going back from here. This will be our new home. No need. Why waste the material on transports when I can beam you down instantaneously? I have 2 vessels right here, ripe for the taking. The clock on my dash reads 4:30 a.m. The darkness outside of my headlights is so thick that I can't see anything to the left or right of me. There isn't a star in the sky, and the moon is eerily absent. The phone call I received last night assured me, though, that the church in Havens Creek is nice, and the congregation was wonderful. I wanted to get there early, get the lay of the land, and put my own little flair to the place. I'd been driving for some time when I finally came up to my turn for the church. I pulled into the parking lot, and what my high beams fell onto absolutely took my breath away. A large, beautiful white church with long columns, a bright red double door, and beautifully stained glass windows with depictions of our Lord and Savior. I stepped out of the car, turning off the headlights, and the night was heavy again. Outside of the interior lights of the church and the solar-powered lights lining the path to the door, I could see nothing. I'll admit, I felt a bit unsettled, but my mentor, Father Reynard, had me come here as a guest pastor, and I was not going to let him down. I made my way up the stairs and into the church. The inside was even more glorious than outside. 50 yards of pews lined down both sides, and a gold-lined red carpet from the door to the pulpit. Getting the full view of the stained glass, I see our Lord and Savior, the cross, our Virgin Mary, cherubs with wings, and the angels up above. Just being inside this place filled my heart with love. I made my way down the gold-lined carpet and to the first pew. I took a seat to relax and just take it all in. Directly next to me was a book I'd come to know very well over my 40 years of life, the Bible. I picked up the very pristine book and sat it in my lap with my hands folded, rested on top of it, and took a deep breath. At this point, I was just trying to take it all in when I heard the front door open. The person's feet sounded hard off the floor with each step, which was strange, seeing as the way up was thickly carpeted. Each step drew nearer and nearer to me, until finally, a man came into view. He was extremely handsome and well dressed. A black suit jacket and pants, with a red vest, and a black tie with red lacy inlays. The man had long blonde hair pulled back out of his face, and an air of authority about him that I just couldn't place. The man walked past me and removed a chair from the rack and walked back towards me. He sat the chair directly in front of me, sat down, and crossed one leg over the other. We both stared at each other in silence for a short time, and just as I was about to speak up, he said, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." His voice rolled out like honey, sweet, yet sinister. I stared back at him. This isn't how we usually do things at my church, I thought to myself. But I am a guest in this house, so I won't push. What is your name, my child? I asked the man sitting in front of me. He cocked his head to the side and smiled. You can call me Sam. Father? He held out the word, so I knew it was a question. Ah, I replied. Salazar. Father Marcielo Salazar. He gave me a slight smile, and his bright blue eyes shone vibrantly. It's very nice to meet you, Father Salazar. As I said before, my name is Sam, and it would be greatly appreciated if you could assist me. I have sinned, and I fear I may wind up in hell. I shook my head softly. Oh, my child, do not worry. Our Father is a forgiving God. Please tell me what burdens you, so I may absolve you of your sins. Sam adjusted his seat, uncrossed his legs, and crossed them the other way. I drink in excess, and then judge others in church when they admit to doing the same. I nodded. Well, my child, I said. Sam quickly cut me off and continued. When I was married, I would have my wife stay at her mother's house when she was on her period. I looked at him as I tried to assure him that the Bible speaks of it being a time of uncleanliness. Sam quickly cut me off again. I sent my son off to a conversion camp when he came out as homosexual. I didn't respond this time, and he continued. I raised my hand to my wife if she tried to leave the house in anything other than modest clothing. I wanted my wife to be modest, but I also received less than modest photographs from my 19-year-old babysitter, Brittany. My eyes widened, and I stood up from the pew I was sitting in. I stepped around the side and began to back away down the aisle towards the door. His soft look hardened in an instant. His bright blue eyes went from soft to dangerous. What's wrong, Father? He spat at me. You look awful. This man was speaking my life back to me. Who are you, and what do you want? My hands and voice were both shaking. I was backing up steadily, and Sam was just staring at me. We were far enough apart that, if I turned for the door, I should be right there. I turned to look over my shoulder at the door, and when I turned back, I was right in front of the church again, face to face with Sam. My eyes widened. What is this? What's going on? I looked around and looked up at the ceiling. All of the stained glass depictions were staring at me, and they looked angry. What does it look like, Father? Sam said. You're being judged. I looked around frantically. Judged? Are you? God? I immediately dropped to my knees and bowed my head. I heard Sam scoff. God? He laughed. You believe a man who led a life such as yours would be judged by my Father? I raised my head and stared up at him. Your Father? I was confused. I ran through my knowledge of Scripture as fast as I could, and it came to me. I looked deep into his eyes and said the only thing I could think of. Samuel. The man smiled a big toothy grin. I stared in horror. I'm dead. Sam winked at me. I applaud you, Marcielo. It takes most of you so much longer to come to that conclusion. Wait, this can't be, I stammered. The devil himself, Lucifer. I may not have been the greatest man during my life, but I followed the Bible as close as I could. I kept my wife in modest clothing, sent her away during her time of uncleanliness, and tried to have my son reborn in the eyes of the Lord. I did falter in my marriage a bit, but how has that earned me an audience with the devil? Sam let out a long, deep laugh. You know, my dear priest, he said. Some say that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. But I assure you, I have done no such thing. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled, dear priest, is convincing the world that the Bible is the Word of God. I stared at him, mouth agape, and my mind running overtime. What do you mean, Sam? I felt on the verge of tears. I mean, I wrote the book that you people flock to. You see, my dear priest, many, many, many years ago, my father created humanity. He loved you with all of his heart and swore that humanity would be perfect. I assured him that no creature with free will would ever be so. He assured me of the contrary, and for the first time in his long life, the devil struck a deal with none other than God himself. I told him that I would add but one thing to this world that would prove the downfall of humanity, and if they proved unfit, he would see me as his right hand. He assured me that it wasn't possible, that humanity was pure and perfect. Now, that book has existed in many forms depending on who holds it, but I wrote them all. I never appeared to Adam and Eve as a snake, but a book bound in snake skin did. I told them of the beauty that lay outside, the glory, the happiness. It spoke of just eating that fruit and experiencing it all. Then, as the first bite was taken, I had won. My father was furious. My brother was bloodthirsty. So began a war in heaven, and my fall from grace. I stared at this man, this being, as he turned everything I thought I knew upside down. Did you not stop and think as to why your loving, malevolent God would have bears turned on children? Why he'd destroy cities full of people in holy fire, or flood the world committing genocide? I stared at him. Because, I said, God's wrath is terrible, but his love is infinite. It was for the greater good, so humanity could be reborn. Sam spoke up. No, not quite. Just a little smoke and mirrors on my end, to put the fear of God in humanity, you know? Sam tilted his head back and laughed again. You people used this book to mask your bigotry and hate, not knowing that one day, your undying soul will land right here on my doorstep. Since humanity's initial birth, I haven't persuaded a single soul to do anything. I haven't had to. That whole, the devil made me do it, it's a crock of shit. The things I wrote made it normal for people to hear voices about murdering their children. Oh, it's God's will. Nope, hi. Sorry again. That's mental illness. Sam looked at me serious and spoke again. Do you believe God makes mistakes? I stood and faced him, headstrong in my conviction. No, I do not, I said, my voice no longer shaking. He stepped forward, almost nose to nose. Then why is it, my dear priest, that you tried to change one of God's creations because it didn't fit your narrative? I took an involuntary step back as he continued. I wrote that book with the idea in mind that hypocrisy would surge. It's laden with enough truth and love to lead the stupid astray. My father loves all life, all things, no matter color or gender. The part about stoning those that lay with the same sex? All me. You hypocrites line my doorstep like lambs to slaughter. That love you feel well up inside when you tell somebody they'll burn in hell for who they love? or living their life not according to your broken vision of an almighty God. It's not love at all, but your soul's acceptance of your truly wicked nature. I clutched the Bible to my chest and just shook my head. No, you are the father of lies. None of this is true. Sam smiled again. Is that what you believe, my dear priest? If so, have a look at the book you so coveted all your life. I pulled the Bible away from my chest and looked down at it, a snakeskin cover, with a 6-winged angel emblazoned on the cover. Sam seemed to stare into my soul. This, my dear priest, is the book that Eve held in her hands when she decided to take that first bite. I opened the book to a language I'd never seen before. Sam looked at me quizzically and turned his head to the side. Huh, he said. My apologies. You can't read Enotion. He waved his hand, and the book glowed white hot. I dropped it immediately and took another step back. I couldn't understand this. If what he was saying was true, my entire life had been a lie. But wait, hold on. What about before the birth of Jesus Christ? Before Christianity? I stammered. Ah, you will find my handiwork in the hieroglyphics, in the halls of ancient Rome, or the diaries of Julius Caesar. I had heard enough. I couldn't take it anymore. Tears openly fell down my cheeks. Now, for my questions, my dear priest. How does it feel knowing that I robbed you of all your earthly desires, only to have your soul remain in hell for eternity? I couldn't answer him. I couldn't even form clear sentences in my head. How does it feel knowing that the wife you detested so much took your son, denounced your wicked ways, and will both thrive for eternity in my Father's kingdom? I felt his hand touch my shoulder, and it burned like nothing I'd ever felt before. I screamed out in agony. As for my final question, this one won't be directed at you, my dear priest, but for our little eavesdroppers here. So tell me, my dear listener, when was the last time you went to church? I saw it when I was eating dinner, a crescent-shaped fingernail clipping lying on the carpet. Aubrey, I yelled. I knew it was a mistake letting my sister Aubrey live with me. She was a slob. There'd always been little hair stubs in the bathtub after she shaved her legs. After she ate a meal, I'd find a trail of crumbs, like she was Hansel trying to mark her path through the woods. And now she'd left a fingernail clipping on the floor? Absolutely disgusting. Yeah? Aubrey asked as she sauntered in. I pointed to the nail. Is that yours? I don't know. I haven't clipped my nails in a while. I kind of just glared at her. Finally, she stooped over and picked it up. Sorry, she muttered, dropping it in the trash. Maybe I was being mean, but I'd had enough of her messing the place up. She was 20, damn it, and old enough to know she should clean up her messes. It was the least she could do while I let her live here, rent-free, while she searched for a job. But lo and behold, I found more. On Tuesday evening, 2 crescent-shaped nails lying in the dead center of the living room. Their placement seemed intentional, honestly, like she wanted me to find them. The couch was all the way across the room. There's no way a nail, let alone 2, flew that far. Aubrey, I growled under my breath. But that's what she wanted. She wanted to get under my skin. Otherwise, why would she leave them out like that? I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I picked up the fingernail pieces and threw them in the trash. The next day, I found one neatly perched on the toilet seat cover. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. Aubrey, I yelled. A few seconds passed, then she poked her head in. Yeah? Why are you doing this? Doing what? I pointed to the fingernail clipping. I didn't do that. I narrowed my eyes at her. I didn't. Okay, fine, whatever. I picked up the nail, dropped it in the toilet, and flushed, staring at her the whole time. I decided to set up some security cameras. That was probably overboard, but I already had a few cameras I'd gotten several months ago, on the advice of a neighbor, and it was just one of those things that I never got around to. So, I put up 2, one in the hall upstairs and one in the living room. I think she must have noticed I put them up, because I didn't find any more fingernail clippings for a week or so. Things got pretty good between us. Aubrey picked up more of the chores and even made us dinner a few times. She was really falling into her adulting role. Everything came crashing down when I found the pile. A pile of fingernail clippings in the middle of my bedroom floor, neatly swept into a little pile. God damn it, Aubrey. I stood there for several seconds, my anger starting to boil. No, I won't give her the satisfaction. I crouched down and began scooping up the fingernail clippings myself. That's when I stopped dead. What the hell? These can't be Aubrey's. I had never really studied them up close before, but there was no way they could be Aubrey's. The nails were too large, like they belonged to a man's hands, and thick and yellowed, as if old. Aubrey. She came running out. Yeah? Did you put these nails here? No, I didn't. And then we heard it, a resounding thump above us. In the attic. We bolted. Get in the car, I yelled as we ran out the front door. As soon as she dove in, I clicked the lock shut, starting the car up. Some bastard has been playing with us, I breathed, my hand dangling over the gear shift, ready to take off at any second. Call the police. As Aubrey called, I stared at the front door. Who was inside? I'd heard the news stories, weirdos sneaking into people's houses and living there, undetected, for months. Was someone living in our attic? How long had they been there? Weeks? Months? Just spying on us? Flashing red and blue lights appeared in my rearview mirror. We told the officers what was going on. Then we sat there in the car, engine idling, as they searched the house. Aubrey didn't say anything. She just stared blankly, her face as white as a sheet. I'm so sorry, Aubrey, I said, reaching out and squeezing her hand. It's okay, she said, distantly. Then she turned to me. This is so scary. Bang, a gunshot. Drive, Aubrey screamed. I shot out of the driveway. The car swerved onto the road. Then I put the pedal to the floor and sped down the road. The police found us 20 minutes later, huddled in fear in the parking lot of the HOA clubhouse. "Ma'am?" I rolled down the window. He shot me a friendly smile. "Don't worry, we got everything under control. There was a person living in your attic, a homeless man, set up a little home for himself and everything." "How long was he living there?" Aubrey asked, her voice trembling. He shot us a reassuring smile. "Only a few days at most." "Did you?" I choked on the words. "Is he dead?" The officer's expression hardened. "Yes, he is, ma'am. I'm sorry. He was aggressive and violent when we confronted him. We had no choice." He sighed. "You'll have to find another place to stay for a few days, okay?" And that was it. After giving him our statement, he bid us goodnight and left. We ended up staying at my friend's house, 20 minutes away. But as I lay there in the darkness, trying to fall asleep, something struck me. How long was he living there? Only a few days at most? I'd found the first fingernail clipping almost 2 weeks ago. That's when I remembered. The footage. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and navigated to the security app. I found the latest footage, dated a few hours ago from the hall camera, and pressed play. The image was low quality and grainy, but it was clear enough. I saw 3 officers walk down the hall. They stopped underneath the attic hatch, talking in low voices the camera didn't pick up. Then, one of them, the one we'd spoken to, grabbed the string and yanked. He started up the stairs. The other 2 officers drew their guns, and one of them followed. Thumps echoed off screen as they walked around the attic. Then, bang, the gunshot. An unintelligible shout. The 3rd officer holstered his gun and disappeared. Then he came back with some equipment and went up. The screen showed the empty hallway. 5 minutes went by, then 10. Then the first one came back down. He was carrying something large in a body bag. Even with the low resolution, I could make out the rough shape of head and shoulders, enshrouded in shiny black plastic. Nausea crept in my throat. There's a dead body in there. As much of a sicko as the guy was, I still felt awful watching. The next officer came down, and then the next. They grunted and groaned as they maneuvered the body down the stairs and into the hall. Wait, what the hell? The body bag. It was easily 10 feet long. The officers sighed as they heaved the immense thing down the hallway. The black plastic stretched and shone in the lights, showing off contours that were unnatural for any human to have. Bony protrusions where the elbows and arms should have been. A middle that was far too thin. I lay there, paralyzed, staring at the screen. That's when I first started having doubts about buying a house in Pelican Peak. I live in a small but lively town in Massachusetts. Its local legends have fueled my love affair with the paranormal. It's a subject that fascinates me to this day, coupled with insomnia. This passion led me to spend many a night at the nearby cemetery, hoping to see a ghostly apparition while walking through to pass the time. These outings were unfruitful, void of all activity, supernatural or otherwise. My dream of stealing a glimpse at what comes after eventually subsided, but I continued to visit the graves. It was a place where I could collect my thoughts when sleep eluded me. One night, however, something changed. It was a dark spring evening. I was bored, couldn't sleep, and felt the need to do something outdoors, in the cool night air. As it so often did, the local graveyard called out to me. I obliged, unable to resist the allure of its calming nature. Sometimes, I was even tempted to set up camp there and sleep amongst the dead. Knowing this would be frowned upon and perhaps morbid, I settled for my walks. They were enough to make me at least somewhat weary by night's end. After a couple of hours there, I decided on one last stroll along the headstones in an attempt to become tired before heading home. Upon starting my walk, I noticed something. There was a light on in the groundskeeper's shack. It wasn't like him to be working so late. This was completely out of the ordinary, until you factored in the large gaping hole nearby, big enough for several caskets. It was a miracle I hadn't fallen into it earlier in the night. Curious as to what the old man was up to, I crept over to the shack, making my way to the busted window on its side. What I saw was strange. Inside were 9 men wearing tattered blue shrouds, partaking in a makeshift feast. The main course was an oily, red stew with a horrific smell that permeated up the shack's walls and ventured up my nasal passage, tempting me to gag. The men winced when putting it to their lips, save for 3. A tall man at the end of the table, and the 2 sat beside him. When the feast was over, this tall figure stood up and addressed the room. "Hello, newcomers. I hope dinner has been to your liking." He spoke with a firm voice. It resonated throughout the shack and beckoned even me to listen. "Now that our bellies are full, Elijah, will you explain the rules of your impending trial?" I listened closely. It seemed the men in the shack were part of a collective known as the Bloodlights. The trial the tall man spoke of was something akin to a medieval gladiator sport used to initiate new members. I listened on as Elijah divulged the game's inner workings, fearful but curious. 2 teams were to disperse to opposite sides of the cemetery, each consisting of 4 members, 3 blood runners, and 1 blood baron. The initiates would be the runners, and the tall man's henchmen would act as the barons. There was one more participant to be discussed: the tall man himself. He was the blood keeper. Though not on either team, he was the most crucial facet of the game. He kept and guarded what was referred to as the blood. I gathered that this referred to the red amulet hanging from the keeper's neck, as he firmly clasped it every time the word blood was uttered. The job of the runners was to retrieve the blood from the keeper. The barons acted as counsel, overseeing each team and helping where needed. After Elijah finished his lecture, the blood keeper took over. "With every wound, there is blood. With every drop of blood, there is solace. Without death, there can be no light." The keeper opened a large cupboard in the corner of the shack, revealing a woman, bound and gagged, futilely attempting to cry out for help. My heart sank. This was not your normal run-of-the-mill cult ritual. I had to find help, but what if they heard me? Unable to nail down my next course of action, I was immobile, frozen in fear. The blood keeper continued. "The light of blood can only be seen in death." Pulling a large red dagger out from his cloak, he grabbed the woman and plunged it into her gut. I watched in horror as the life left her eyes. She began to shriek, but was soon cut off by a cut to the chest. followed by a final blow to her neck. I was mortified. After throwing his kill to the floor, the keeper pulled out 3 vials, filling each of them with blood that dripped from his blade. This was the blood the runners were after, not the amulet. This is all the blood I have to offer. That gives, at most, 3 of you the opportunity to become bloodlights. And remember, you are being watched. Those who fail to collect must be disposed of. The same goes for any outsiders you encounter. Corpses are to be thrown in the pit. Dear God, I was truly in danger. That's what the nearby hole was for, the perfect hiding spot for a mass grave. You must stop at nothing to obtain one of these vials. All others will be sacrificed. Your thirst for blood must be as strong as your will to live. The men exited the shack to begin the trial. I scurried silently to the wooded part of the graveyard and hid behind a large tree. Not wanting to end up like that poor woman, I just needed an opening to escape without being noticed. Glancing out at the cemetery, I saw a runner knelt before a grave, eyes closed. I assumed this was a requirement before the game commenced. A perfect chance for me to make a run for it. Let the trial begin. The Bloodkeeper's voice echoed through the trees. Before I could even take a single step towards safety, my survival still hung in the balance. Using a moonlit pool of water by my feet as a reflective surface, I watched as Elijah and 3 runners strategized, just 10 yards from my position. My heart was pounding so hard, I worried they could hear it. Between the beating in my chest and the conspiring whispers that filled the forest, my ears were consumed with an unsettling symphony of torture. Just when I couldn't bear another moment, silence cut through the brisk night air, like the keeper's dagger piercing that woman's skin. A chill then buried into my spine. The puddle's reflection bore no cloaked figures. Peering out from behind the tree confirmed that they were gone, or at least, nowhere to be seen. This was my chance. Looking off in the distance, I saw a tomb by the main road, maybe 100 yards away. It would provide the perfect cover to escape towards civilization, but there was no way I could waltz over there without being seen. The woods wrapped around the cemetery, so running from tree to tree would strengthen my odds of survival. I took a deep breath and braced myself. Without so much as a second thought, I dashed to the next tree on the path to safety and took cover. I then gathered my wits and surveyed my surroundings. No cloaks in sight. I sprinted to the next tree and took another glimpse out at the world. The coast was still clear. As I was about to take off in the direction of my next hiding spot, panic set in as my feet inexplicably left the solid ground. My blood ran cold as I was lifted into the air by some unseen force. The next thing I knew, my body was hoisted up and placed atop a tree branch. There, I was greeted by the unnerving sight of my captor, a blood runner. I didn't scream or tried to get away. It would be no use. I sat there in terror and exhaled what I thought would be my last breath. But instead of gutting me, the man spoke. "What's your name?" I was too shocked to respond. "Come on now, who are you?" He spoke clearer this time, revealing a slight English accent. "Look, I noticed you at the window over there, eavesdropping. If I wanted you dead, I could have killed you then. I want you to help me." "Help you?" I asked. "Yes, I'm going to use you to my advantage. I take it you know what we're doing here, and you know the rules of the game." I nodded slowly, still shook. "Good. With you, I may be able to turn the tables and get the upper hand." I was frightened, but I calmed down enough to focus on the runner's plan. See that tomb over there? That's where the blood keeper is. My stomach turned. To think, this guy may have just saved my life. I need you to go over to the tomb and open the door. Slowly. The blood keeper will surely take a swing at you. Just as he's about to end your life, I'll swoop in and end his. But why? I asked. That's not part of the game. Right you are. You need not concern yourself with the why. Just know that if you don't do as I say, I'll kill you myself. Now get going. The man gave me his cloak for protection and pushed me out of the tree. I didn't want to risk facing the blood keeper, but I didn't want to perish at the runner's hands either. My fear of dying kept me from deviating. I again ran from tree to tree, eventually making it to my destination, the stench of bloodshed wafting through the air as the runners fought for control of the field. With my back pressed to the cold aged stone, the pull to escape grew. The main road was within reach, but the thought quickly subsided. I was far too worried the Englishman would catch up with me and take his price. He was able to climb a tree and lift my weight into it without a sound. It was clear he possessed the agility and stealth needed to take me by surprise during a haphazard run for the hills. I sighed in defeat, knowing that, one way or another, I would probably die that night. Mustering up every bit of courage I had left, I crept around the tomb and faced its door. My shaking hands reached for the rusted handle and pulled it towards me. Before its hinges could even creak at the motion, the door burst open, pushed from within. The force knocked me over, my head connecting with the unforgiving ground. The moments that came after remained fuzzy. The blood keeper towered over me, half his body in shadow, the other soaked in moonlight. A vision of death there to still the blood from my racing heart. My eyes grew weary and shut for an instant before opening to see another figure. I couldn't make out who was who in my dazed state, but one attacked the other, completely overpowering them. The prey in this scuffle fell to his knees, before landing face first into the cold cemetery soil. The familiar sound of metal colliding with flesh rang through the air, as the victor saw to it that the job was done. I prayed it was the blood keeper being torn apart. Otherwise, I was a goner. My eyes shut again, before unconsciousness finally took hold. "Hey, are you all right?" I heard an old man's voice as I came to. "Are you okay?" I opened my eyes to see who it was. The groundskeeper stood over me, holding a lantern to my face. "What? How? Where are they?" "Where's who?" he asked. "You don't understand. I should be dead." The groundskeeper stared at me, confused, but then smiled. "Come on, kid. You'll catch a cold out here." The groundskeeper, who I now know to be Pete, invited me into his shack. He prepared some food and tossed me a blanket to keep warm. Thankful, and in need of an ear to fill, I told him everything, despite how I knew it would sound. I didn't describe the men by their given titles, but Pete seemed to know who I was talking about. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the blood keeper." "That's him. How did you know?" "His spirit has been visiting these grounds for over 100 years now, I suppose." His spirit? Incredible. It was all a haunting. Something I thought I wanted to experience firsthand. Pete and I talked for a long while. He knew all about the bloodlights and their dastardly deeds. Apparently, they were a sadistic cult that formed in the 1800s, terrorizing the local community. Each bloodlight initiation brought with it more disappearances. They used the cemetery as a space for their trials, burying casualties and sacrifices at the end of every night. After all, who would look for bodies in a graveyard? Over 50 souls fell victim to the bloodlights before their sinister games were brought to an end. During their last outing, an Englishman infiltrated their ranks and killed the bloodkeeper, avenging the death of his wife, who had been murdered during one of their trials. Soon after, his disciples came forward, claiming to have control by the bloodkeeper's amulet, alleging that it had supernatural powers. No such amulet was ever recovered. After Pete explained everything, I sat in awe, dumbstruck by the whole ordeal. Had I relived that fateful night? Or did I time travel and help that man fulfill his goal? I may never know what happened that day, but one thing is certain. I will never visit another cemetery for as long as I live, just in case the ghost of the bloodkeeper is still out there, making his rounds. I first saw her in the photo of me walking up the aisle. The shot is from behind. The white train of my dress skims the ground. My blonde hair is rolled up in the silver barrette borrowed from his mom. My something borrowed. Every person in the pews is turned, watching me, except one. A woman in the last row stands stick straight, facing away from the camera. All I can see is the back of her head. Straight, long black hair, flowing down her shoulders and ending at her waist. Jeff, who is that? Jeff leaned over my shoulder. Don't know. Maybe your cousin Jamie? Could be, but her hair isn't that long. I clicked forward several photos. No, it can't be. See? Jamie was wearing a red dress. She's wearing black. I shook my head. Must be someone from your side. She's sitting on your side, though. I guess you're right. I clicked the zoom button. Her form filled the screen. Stick straight black hair, ivory skin, almost impossibly skinny arms. She stood a good distance away from the 5 other people in the pew. My cousin Amanda, her husband, and her 3 rambunctious children, one of whom was picking their nose. Could she be the date of one of my guy friends? Like Jack? Maybe. He was always dating a new girl. I quickly brought up his Facebook. Nope. His current girlfriend had curly hair and a beautiful brown complexion. Not her. I don't recognize her. She's gotta be a wedding crasher. Jeff and I had gotten married 3 weeks ago. We'd just gotten our photos back. I'd brace myself for surprises. Ones that made me look like I had a double chin, or shots of my 60-year-old parents shaking it out on the dance floor. But I didn't expect this. I can't believe it. This was our special day, and this rando thinks she could just come and crash it? I'm sorry, Jess. She could have had the decency to look at me as I walked down the aisle, at least. I grumbled. I clicked away from the photo, trying to forget about her and just enjoy the photos. A few more photos of the ceremony. She wasn't in them. I lingered on the photos of us in the bridal party, my heart glowing. Then I got to the reception photos. She stuck out like a sore thumb, standing there, behind the table of my high school friends, facing away from the camera, standing oddly still. That's her! I jabbed the computer screen so hard, the image rippled. Well, obviously she'd be at the reception. Free food. I'm surprised she went to the ceremony at all. I clicked to the next photo. She wasn't in it. I breathed a sigh of relief. No, wait. I zoomed in. My friend Libby, sitting at the table, had a glass of wine pressed to her lips. I flicked back to the previous photo. Libby was lifting the glass towards her lips. These two photos were taken within a few seconds of each other, and she's just gone? Jeff shrugged. She probably just got her food and skedaddled. I clicked through the next several photos. She wasn't in them. Feeling a bit better, I clicked through the rest and landed on a portrait of the two of us, standing in the middle of the reception hall. Look at us. You two look beautiful. Aw, thank you. My breath caught in my throat. At the edge of the photo, there was a hand touching my shoulder. Just the tips of the fingers, the rest out of view. Pale, thin fingers, not thick, ruddy ones like Jeff's. I stared at the computer, my heart pounding in my chest. Jess, are you okay? His voice sounded so far away. Her fingers, I said softly. Her fingers are on my shoulder. What? Jeff took the laptop, squinting at the screen. That's just my hand, Jess. Your hands look nothing like that. How can you even tell? It's just the tips of the fingers. Tips of a woman's fingers. They're obviously my fingers. No, they're not. I grabbed the laptop from him, forced myself to look at the photo. Look, your arm is going down, like it's wrapped around my waist. Your waist isn't even in the frame. Yeah, but you can tell from the angle. If your hand was resting on my shoulder like that, it would be up more. Jess, it's obviously my hand. He sighed and wrapped his arms around me. Speaking in a softer tone, he said, Look, someone crashed our wedding. That sucks, a lot, but I think you're overreacting a little. I shot him a glare. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed Amanda's number. It took 3 rings for her to pick up. Amanda? Who was sitting next to you at my wedding? Oh, hi, Jess, she said in her slow, southern drawl. Oh, well, you sat us with Uncle Bob and Aunt Margie. No, at the ceremony. Well, I was sitting alone, dear. I purposely chose to. Didn't want my kids hassling anyone. No, there was a woman in the same pew as you. Tall, black hair. No, dear. It was just me, Will, and the kids. I mean, at least I don't remember seeing anyone else. I talked to Amanda another 10 minutes, then said I had to go. I collapsed onto the couch next to Jeff and leaned my head against his shoulder. Jeff reached over and rubbed my shoulders. My eyes flickered closed and my breathing slowed. Don't worry about it, babe. Don't worry about some woman creeping on you at your wedding. It's all okay. I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't like Jeff's tone. The way he was speaking to me like something fragile, easily broken. I'm gonna go take a shower, I said, getting up from the sofa abruptly. I slammed the bathroom door behind me and started to run the water. Peeled off my clothes and stared at myself in the mirror. Steam clouded out from the shower, and I stepped in. The hot water hit my back, running down my body, and the stress began to fade away. I reached for the shampoo, scrubbed it in, rinsed it out, stood under the stream of water, and let it run over my face for a few seconds. Then I turned off the water and began to step out. I glanced down and froze. Collecting around the bathtub drain was a tangled clump of black hair. Before I could react, thin, cold fingers grabbed my shoulder, pushed, I slipped on the wet ceramic, my body falling with a painful crack. Pain shot through my body like fire. As I pulled myself up, grimacing in pain, 8 words repeated in my head. Something odd, something new, something borrowed, something blue. The silver beret I borrowed from Jeff's mom, the one she insisted I borrow, saying it was a family heirloom, that she said Jeff's sister had refused to wear, and it would mean the world if I carried out the tradition. The one thing that had a few straight, black hairs stuck in it. Was I cursed? Unexplained phenomenon is a staple in human culture. Strange goings-on, paranormal in nature, are prominent in our lives, in one form or another. You may not think about them all that often, but there's always a piece in the news or a crazy story from a friend or passerby that makes you recall such strangeness. No matter how many times you forget about the subject, there will always be a moment that drags the notion back to the surface of your memory. For several years, I had forgotten all about the monster living in my mom's pantry. I had forgotten all about it. That is, until now. I was 10 years old when I first became aware of the monster's presence. It was a normal evening at home. My mother and I awaited my father's arrival, and I helped her out with dinner preparations. I look back on these memories fondly. I loved cooking with my mom, and was overjoyed whenever my father came home from work. I had what some would consider a picture-perfect childhood, save from one peculiarity. The thing that resided in the pantry would audibly reveal itself that very night. While cutting up vegetables for my mom's famous beef barley soup, I heard a scratching at the pantry door. Startled, I jumped, nearly cutting off one of my fingers in the process. My mom looked over at the pantry, then to me with a concerned smile. I looked at her for answers, utterly baffled by the noise. There it goes again, scratching at the pantry door. What is it, Mom? I asked. I'm not sure, sweetie, but it's been here ever since we moved in. Sometimes it scratches at the door, other times it'll knock food off the pantry shelves. Some nights, it doesn't make a sound at all. There was no comfort derived from her explanation. I was still frightened, and my mother noticed this. It's nothing to be scared of, honey. Is it something bad? I asked. No, of course not. Just then, the scratching recommenced. I jumped a second time. My mother then walked over to the pantry door. Here, look. She opened it up as the scratching continued. Once the door was completely ajar, the sound ceased. See, sweetie, there's nothing to be worried about. Despite my mother's comforting words, my 10-year-old heart couldn't help but race with fear. In the coming years, I continued to help her cook, but I never once set foot back in that pantry. Convinced that the thing living in there was a monster, out to get me. This fear was kept alive by the scratching that would interrupt otherwise happy moments. I ignored it the best I could, but sometimes I would have to leave the kitchen. Eventually, the sound stopped altogether. It's now been many, many years since then, and both of my parents have passed away. In their wills, I was left everything, including my childhood home. It took me a while to come to terms with their deaths and move back in, but I eventually accepted the situation and embraced the living space where I grew up. It was the little memories sprinkled throughout the house that helped me cope. Sometimes I would walk in the living room and see my dad sitting in his chair, smoking a cigar and watching his favorite sitcom. At other points, I would see my mother in the kitchen, making us dinner. These corporal fragments from a time long since past, they kept me going. After work, the house felt like home again. Until one day, I had just arrived home from work when it happened. I sat down on my dad's favorite chair and flipped onto the TV to unwind. Something crossed my mind, minus the tobacco. I had actually become my father. This thought put a bit of a smile on my face as I reclined the chair to relax. Relaxation never came though, as an all too familiar scratching sound emanated from the nearby pantry. My smile quickly vanished. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen to investigate. The scratching continued and increased in volume. I stared at the door hoping an answer would just jump out at me, but also hoping whatever was inside wouldn't do the same. Without many options at my disposal, I was forced to open it. Much with my anticipation, the noise ceased, and I found nothing behind the door but some empty shelves and an old broom. This was the same thing that happened when my mother opened the door many years ago. I was no longer a frightened child, but the sound's return was still unnerving. At least, it was at first. After a while, it became nothing more than a bothersome fixture in my otherwise normal days. Whenever I came home from work, woke up in the middle of the night, or sat down to watch television, that terrible scratching would invade my ear space, not stopping until I opened that damn pantry door. This routine continued for over a year. One night, however, everything changed. I had just gotten home from a long day of work and flung myself into the comfort of my bed sheets. I wanted more than anything to drift off into a peaceful slumber, hoping the day's troubles would melt away in the form of happy dreams and restful sleep. Unfortunately for me, the moment my head hit the pillow, the scratching started up once more. I groaned in anger, not wanting to leave my bed for anything, much less that damn noise. Because of this, I made the mistake of not getting up right away. I hit my internal snooze button and allowed myself to drift off for a few moments. When I came to, something was amiss. I didn't notice it at first, but the unsettling silence made way for a startling revelation. The scratching had stopped. How strange. It's never stopped on its own before. Perplexed, I jumped out of bed and ventured downstairs to investigate. What I saw upon entering the kitchen alarmed me. The pantry door was wide open. That can't be. It was definitely closed when I got home earlier. Turning on the light only revealed the usual empty shelves. It wasn't until my hand met the wood of the door that I noticed something unusual. Embedded in the hard oak were deep gashes, claw marks that covered the entire bottom half of the door. Those weren't there before. What the hell is going on? My childhood was beginning to catch up with me. Memories of the pantry came bursting through the floodgates. The scratches, the nightmares, the fear. But I wasn't a child this time, and I wasn't going to let a superstition get the better of me. It was just a raccoon or a larger rat, that's all. At least, that's what I told myself. I scoured the house for nearly an hour, ignoring my fast-beating heart the whole time. Whatever escaped from the pantry was nowhere to be found. As I stepped back into the kitchen to close the door and call it a night, something stopped me in my tracks. A shadowy figure raced across my field of vision and into the pantry. Slam! The pantry door shut on its own, shaking the walls around it. A bone-chilling vibration reverberated throughout the entire house in an instant, and was then followed by an eerily dead silence. My heart sank into my bowels. I was officially rattled. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find and piled them in front of the door, including my dad's old chair. Once satisfied with my blockade, I raced upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and jumped underneath my sheets. I was a kid again, scared shitless of the monster living in my mom's pantry. After the fear and adrenaline tapered off, I managed to get a little bit of rest. My late-night adventure had come to an end. I woke up the next morning in denial, a defense mechanism of a mind bruised by fear. Pretending nothing happened the previous night, I went about my morning routine as normal. After breakfast, I was able to walk right past the pile of crap in front of the pantry door without flinching. I even ignored the scratch marks on my front door as I left for work. Everything was fine. There was no monster, no supernatural entity taking over my home. That was absurd. It was just a raccoon, a very large raccoon. The lies only lasted for so long. Driving away, the terror set back in, sending me into a desperate frenzy of distress and unease. Though distracted by my strange predicament, I managed to make it to work in one piece. Work brought me no solace. All I could think about was what awaited me at home. I was on the edge and my boss noticed this. He asked if I needed to leave early and get some rest. I practically shouted the word no at him, begging him to let me stay. I wanted to be away from that house as long as I could. Though confused by my unorthodox behavior, my boss obliged. I might have been able to stay at work, but I had to clock out eventually. The day went by far too quickly, and before I knew it, I was back home, sitting in my driveway, dreading the thought of opening the front door. Because of this, I sat in my car for a while, attempting to come up with a plan of action. What do I do? Who can I tell? Where will I stay? The question swirled around my tired mind until I shut my eyes and took a deep breath to relax. The weariness caught up with me in this moment, causing me to drift off in a stress-induced coma of sorts. I woke up a few hours later to the terrifying sight of scratch marks on my driver's side window. That was the last straw. That's it, I proclaimed out loud. I wasn't going to let this thing control my life, and I certainly wasn't going to let it drive me out of my own home. This is where I grew up, where I spent my childhood with my mother and father. They were still with me, the recollections scattered throughout the house, reminding me of who they were and the impact they had on my life. No amount of scratching was going to tear through the memories I had of them. Fed up, I got out of my car, walked up to the house, and swung the front door open. I was greeted with the sound of scratching, but this time, it was louder than it had ever been before. As I stormed over to the kitchen, the noise morphed into a thunderous banging at the pantry door, causing the stuff I piled in front of it to move a bit. Whatever was inside really wanted to get out this time. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, My fight or flight response was begging me to run, but it was too late. I had already made up my mind. I was going to face this thing head on and get to the bottom of the mystery. This was my home, after all. It belonged to me and my family, not whatever this thing was. In removing the stack of furniture, the banging continued to grow louder. The kitchen cabinets around me swung open. Various pots and pans fell off the shelves. An earthquake of supernatural proportions filled my home. But I didn't allow it to rattle me. I knew what I had to do. After a moment of mental preparation, I opened the pantry door. There, sitting behind the door, was a dog. It sat there and looked up at me in confusion. I did the same to it. After giving me a once-over, it walked over to me and nuzzled up against my leg. I instinctively reached down and pet it, as I would any dog. But this wasn't any dog. After a few moments of getting to know each other, it walked back into the pantry and vanished before my very eyes. It was a ghost. My fear completely dissipated after that day. I now come home to the sound of scratching and smile. I no longer open the pantry door in fear, but instead, to let my new friend out. He walks around the house, exploring, just like a normal dog would. He even sits down and watches TV with me from time to time. He's a bit shy though, vanishing whenever I have company over. Still, he is a good dog, a very good dog. I assume he belonged to one of the many owners of the house, seeing as it had been built long before my parents moved in. I guess he just couldn't let the place go. Neither could I. After a few weeks of bonding, I realized that I didn't have anything to call him by. I walked over to the little guy and pet him on the back of his neck. That was his favorite spot. I thought about it for a moment, and then came up with the perfect name. I will call you Monster.